Inside Stone Mill Correctional Facility, a place built from cold stone and heavy iron, life moved at a slow, punishing rhythm. The clang of metal doors and the barked orders of guards became a kind of background music for the men trapped inside. Violence simmered in every corner, alliances shifted daily, and loneliness weighed on those who had been forgotten by the world outside. In that bleak environment, 3 men found something unusual, something that stood apart from the constant hostility of prison life. It began as small gestures, moments that most people wouldn't have noticed. But within prison walls where every action was scrutinized, it quickly grew into something that sparked whispers. Damien was the first to draw attention. He had been inside the system for years, a man with tattoos carved into his skin like a resume of violence. His reputation gave him authority, but it also left him isolated. He was not someone others wanted to cross, nor someone they wanted to be close to. Yet, despite his reputation, Damien had a magnetic quality that drew people to him. He carried himself with confidence and spoke with a kind of authority that demanded attention. When Caleb and Luis crossed his path, he saw something in them that intrigued him. Caleb was older, a man with glasses and soft hands, not built for the hard edges of prison. He had been a businessman once, convicted of financial crimes that earned him no respect inside. Luis was younger, wiry, with restless energy and eyes that revealed a hunger for belonging. Both men were vulnerable in different ways, and Damien knew it. Their connection began in the cafeteria. At first it was simply sharing a table when others avoided them. Then came the small acts, trading food, watching each other's backs, cutting in line together as if they were a unit. Slowly, the 3 became inseparable. They spent recreation time together, walked the yard side by side, and worked in the laundry where few others bothered to pay attention. Guards noticed but said little. In a place where gangs dominated and violence was routine, 3 men spending time together didn't seem dangerous, but to the other inmates, it was a spectacle. Whispers started about how close they were, how Caleb seemed protected, and how Luis seemed to idolize Damien. It didn't take long for rumors to twist into talk of something more. The idea of intimacy inside prison was not new. It happened often enough, but it was rarely spoken about openly. What made this different was the way they carried themselves. Damien seemed to take pride in being the center of the trio, while Caleb and Luis revolved around him like planets around a sun. In a place where survival was about strength, they found in each other something resembling comfort. That comfort, however, came at a cost. Some inmates mocked them, others kept their distance, and a few began to view them as a target. It was not only about the relationship, it was about power, jealousy, and the shifting balance of control in a place where weakness was fatal. For Caleb, the bond was a lifeline. He had entered prison lost and terrified, but with Damien beside him, he felt a strange kind of safety. Damien offered protection in exchange for loyalty, and Caleb gave it without hesitation. For Luis, the bond was something else entirely. He was young, with no family visiting him, no letters, no one waiting for him outside. To him, Damien represented strength, but he also represented something closer to love. That affection grew stronger with each day, even as it became clear that Damien's attention was divided. Luis began to notice the way Damien spoke to Caleb in private moments, the way their eyes met when no one else was watching. That spark fed his insecurities, planting seeds of jealousy that would eventually take root. What none of them fully understood was how fragile their bond really was. Inside prison, emotions could be more dangerous than knives. Affection turned into obsession quickly, and jealousy could spiral into rage with little warning. While Damien believed he controlled the dynamic, the truth was far more complicated. Caleb's dependence made him pliable, but also desperate. Luis's longing made him loyal but also volatile, and Damien's dominance gave him power, but also painted a target on his back. The 3 of them together created a tension that others could sense, even if they didn't fully understand it. By the time months had passed, their relationship was no longer a secret. Inmates whispered about it in the yard, guards exchanged knowing looks, and the three men themselves leaned into the closeness they had built. They walked together, with a confidence that seemed to challenge the unspoken rules of prison life. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. The same bond that brought them comfort also brought them danger. The same closeness that shielded them from loneliness exposed them to jealousy, and the same loyalty that made them inseparable tied them together in a way that none of them could escape. The prison walls had seen countless fights, betrayals, and tragedies, but few could sense that within this unlikely triangle, something was building. Something that would not end in whispered rumors or quiet arguments. Something that would, in time, leave a stain no amount of bleach in the laundry room could ever wash away. The bond that had once given Damien, Caleb, and Louis strength began to shift in ways none of them could control. What had started as companionship grew heavy with tension, and the balance of power tilted sharply toward Damien. He thrived on control. In the yard, his reputation made him untouchable, but inside their trio, he took that authority further, dictating every detail of their lives together. Caleb, with his quiet nature and fear of confrontation, slipped easily into the role Damien demanded of him. He accepted instructions without argument, whether it was giving up part of his meal, avoiding certain inmates, or staying close at all times. Louis, however, was less willing to submit. His youth made him reckless, and while he admired Damien, he also wanted more from him. More recognition, more affection, more proof that he wasn't just a shadow standing behind. That difference slowly poisoned what they had built. In the laundry room where they often worked together, arguments started to surface. They were never loud enough to draw the attention of guards, but the energy was unmistakable. Louis would question why Damien seemed to favor Caleb, why he spoke softly to him in private moments, why Caleb always seemed to receive a look of approval that Louis longed for. Caleb, trapped in the middle, grew uneasy, but his unease only deepened his dependence. He had nobody else to turn to, and leaving Damien's side felt impossible. The quiet businessman who once shuffled through his sentence invisible to others was now entangled in something he couldn't step away from without consequences. The prison environment magnified every emotion. There was no escape from each other. They ate at the same tables, slept in the same block, and worked in the same room. Jealousy had nowhere to dissipate. It thickened, like steam trapped inside a locked chamber, growing hotter until it threatened to explode. Louis began watching Caleb constantly, studying every glance, every word, every gesture exchanged between him and Damien. The more he watched, the more certain he became that Caleb was replacing him in Damien's eyes. That thought festered into obsession. Damien, for his part, enjoyed the power. He thrived on knowing that both men depended on him. They fought, not only for his attention, but for his approval. To him, it was a game of loyalty. He believed he could keep them both under control through intimidation and charm. But what he failed to see, or perhaps refused to admit, was that the triangle he had built was unstable. It wasn't just a matter of affection or dominance anymore. It was about identity, survival, and the aching need for belonging in a place that stripped men of everything else. As weeks stretched into months, the rumors about them became sharper. Other inmates mocked Louis for his attachment, calling him Damien's pet. They whispered about Caleb being soft, about how he had no business aligning himself with men like Damien. For Louis, the ridicule was unbearable. He wanted desperately to be seen as Damien's equal, not a side figure tolerated for convenience. Each insult fed his resentment, and that resentment turned not only against those who taunted him, but against Caleb himself. Caleb sensed the shift. He began noticing the way Louis glared at him during meals, the way his silence stretched long and heavy in their cell block, the way his jaw tightened whenever Damien gave him a word of encouragement. Caleb feared confrontation, yet he also feared losing Damien's protection. Without Damien, he was vulnerable. He knew other inmates still remembered his weakness when he first arrived, and he knew how quickly prison could swallow men like him whole. That fear bound him tighter to Damien, which only deepened Louis's jealousy. Their relationship became less about comfort and more about control. Each man's emotions pulled the trio in different directions, but the walls of the prison forced them together. The very closeness that had once been their strength turned into a cage. The smallest disagreements stretched into nights of simmering silence. A misplaced word could ruin an entire day. And all the while, the power dynamic pressed down harder. Damien grew harsher, Louis grew more volatile, and Caleb grew more desperate. The other inmates saw what was happening. Even if the three of them didn't, they noticed the way Louis clenched his fists whenever Damien and Caleb shared a private moment. They saw Caleb following Damien around the yard like a shadow. They heard Damien's voice, firm and commanding, carrying across the block while the others listened quietly. What they didn't see, but what was inevitable, was how all those tensions would eventually collide. Inside Stone Mill, violence often erupted without warning, but in this case, it was different. It was slow, deliberate, like a fuse burning closer and closer to an unseen stick of dynamite. Every glance, every rumor, every whispered insult was a spark, and the three men, trapped in their own web of dependence and desire, were helpless to stop what was coming. The triangle that had once shielded them from the loneliness of prison had now transformed into a trap. With each passing day, their obsession with one another grew sharper, darker, and more dangerous, pushing them all closer to a breaking point that no one could avoid. The day that would set everything in motion began like any other inside Stone Mill. The air was heavy with the smell of disinfectant, and the dull clang of doors echoed down the corridors as inmates shuffled to their work assignments. For Damien, Caleb, and Louis, the laundry room was familiar ground. It was a place tucked away from the noise of the yard, filled with the constant churn of industrial machines and the thick scent of bleach and detergent. To most inmates it was nothing more than another routine shift, but for the three of them, it had become a private battleground where unspoken tensions played out under the cover of endless work. The pressure inside their trio had been building for weeks. Damien's control was no longer just a matter of loyalty. It was a test of obedience. He expected Caleb and Louis to prove themselves constantly, whether by running errands in the block or giving up privileges when he demanded it. Caleb accepted it, though with a growing weariness that he tried to hide. Louis, however, simmered under the weight of humiliation. He could feel Damien slipping further away from him, favoring Caleb in small but unmistakable ways. A look across the room, a nod of approval after a completed task, a rare word of encouragement. Each one landed on Caleb, leaving Louis in the shadows. The laundry room amplified these resentments. Inmates worked in pairs, or small groups, but the three always stuck together, folding sheets and sorting uniforms. The hum of the dryers drowned out conversation, but glances spoke louder than words. Louis's eyes followed every move Damien and Caleb made, every subtle exchange that fed his jealousy. What he felt was no longer just envy. It was betrayal. In his mind, Caleb had taken something from him, something he believed was rightfully his. On that particular afternoon, the heat inside the room seemed unbearable. Machines rattled and clanged, pumping warm air into the confined space. Sweat clung to their skin as they moved through the motions of their shift. It was then that Damien decided to confront Louis. To him, Louis's brooding had become a problem, a sign of weakness that threatened the control he worked so hard to maintain. Damien's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the noise. His accusations fell hard, pushing Louis into a corner he couldn't escape. Caleb, caught between them, tried to diffuse the moment with small gestures of calm, but his efforts only made things worse. To Louis, Caleb's attempts at peace looked like condescension, as if he were pitying him. To Damien, Caleb's involvement was unnecessary interference. The air grew heavier with every passing second, each man locked in a silent struggle over loyalty, power, and pride. That was when the hidden weapon appeared. It wasn't unusual for inmates to fashion crude blades from scraps of metal, but the sight of one in the laundry room turned tension into panic. No one knew who had smuggled it in, but in an instant it became the center of everything. A sharp glint of steel caught in the fluorescent light, and the fragile balance between them shattered. The shouting turned into shoving, the shoving into wild swings. The room erupted in chaos. The clatter of laundry carts overturned, the metallic crash of trays hitting the ground, and the desperate scuffle of bodies colliding echoed louder than the machines themselves. Caleb, desperate to stop the fight, found himself caught between Damien and Luis, their rage pulling him in both directions. Each strike, each frantic movement, carried the weight of months of resentment. This wasn't a fight over territory or prison politics. It was a fight born of obsession, jealousy, and the tangled mess of emotions they could no longer control. Time inside that room seemed to bend. Seconds stretched into minutes as the violence spiraled further. The other workers in the laundry kept their distance, afraid to step in. Guards weren't close enough to intervene immediately, leaving the three men trapped in their storm. The weapons slashed through the air, and with it came the first cries of pain. Blood stained the white uniforms piled on the tables, spreading across fabric that had once been destined for cleaning. Caleb's attempts at peace turned to desperation. But by then, it was too late. He was no longer the middle ground. He was a target, caught in the crossfire. Damien's fury at being challenged and Luis's rage at being replaced collided in a way that spared no one. The laundry room, once their refuge, became a cage filled with violence that could not be undone. By the time the first shouts of guards echoed down the hall, the breaking point had already been reached. The three men, bound together by a toxic mix of loyalty and betrayal, had crossed into something irreversible. The fight was no longer just about jealousy or control, it was survival, and in the heat of that survival all three would pay the ultimate price. The laundry room, normally filled with the hum of machines and the steady rhythm of routine, had become a scene of chaos that spread like fire through dry grass. The clanging of overturned carts, mixed with the deep roar of dryers, a soundtrack to the violence unfolding inside. Blood began to splash across the white uniforms waiting to be folded, turning them into grotesque reminders of the brutality taking place. The sharpened piece of metal glinted each time it cut through the air, and with every swing, the three men descended further into madness. Damien fought with the raw strength of a man, determined to maintain control at all costs. Years of prison hardened his body and sharpened his instincts, and he struck with ruthless precision. Luis, however, moved with desperation, his fury fueled by jealousy and heartbreak. His attacks were wild, less calculated, but driven by the intensity of someone who felt everything had been stolen from him. Between them, Caleb was dragged into the storm. He had never been a fighter. His instincts were not sharpened by violence but by fear, and in that moment, his fear was not enough to protect him. He tried to separate the others, grabbing at their arms, shoving them apart, but the small space offered no escape. Each attempt only pulled him closer to the blade and closer to the rage. The struggle moved like a storm around the room, knocking over piles of laundry, shattering plastic bins, and smearing blood onto walls and machines. The white walls of the facility, designed to feel sterile and controlled, were streaked with crimson that seemed to grow with each passing second. The air became thick, heavy with the metallic scent of blood, mixed with bleach and detergent. For those who witnessed from a distance, it was impossible to know who was winning, or if winning was even possible in a fight like this. Luis's body trembled with rage as he lashed out at Damien. His strikes carried no discipline, but each one was powered by months of bitterness. Damien countered with brutal force, pushing him back against the spinning dryers, pinning him, then unleashing blows that echoed like hammers against metal. Luis gasped, but he did not stop. His jealousy refused to let him back down even as blood poured from wounds that weakened his movements. He screamed, a sound lost in the chaos of machines, a sound that carried both fury and despair. Caleb's role in the struggle changed quickly. Once he tried to play the peacemaker, but the violence made that impossible. A misstep brought the blade across his chest, and the shock of pain dropped him to his knees. His blood joined the growing pool on the floor, staining his prison uniform in thick patterns that blurred the number stamped on his chest. Yet even in agony, he tried to pull Damien back, tried to stop Luis's desperate lunges. His survival instinct clashed with his loyalty, leaving him torn between saving himself and saving the bond he had depended on. The fight stretched on, but inside the closed room, time seemed to vanish. Seconds felt endless, minutes felt eternal. The three men, once bound by their secret connection, now became enemies locked in a death spiral. Every swing of the blade and every strike of fists carried the weight of betrayal. It was not simply about anger, it was about everything unsaid, everything hidden, everything that festered in silence, until it exploded here. Luis's strength began to fade first. Blood loss slowed him, his movements jerky and uneven. Damien, seeing weakness, pressed harder. His dominance, the very thing that had built their strange relationship, now pushed him to destroy it. He drove Luis into the corner, striking again and again until Luis collapsed, sliding down the wall and leaving a smear of red behind him. Caleb, barely able to stand, staggered toward Damien in a final act of desperation, clutching at his arm. That single moment sealed his fate. The blade turned, quick and merciless, plunging into his body. His breath left him in a sharp gasp as he crumpled to the floor beside Luis. For a moment, silence fell inside the room except for the machines, still running as if nothing had changed. Damien stood in the center, his chest heaving, his hands slick with blood. He looked down at Caleb and Luis, both motionless, and for the first time doubt flickered in his eyes, but the silence did not last. From behind, Luis, barely clinging to life, gathered the last of his strength. With a surge of desperation, he lunged, dragging Damien down with him. The blade twisted in the scramble, cutting into both bodies at once. A final struggle, quick and savage, ended with both men collapsing onto the blood-soaked floor. When the guards finally reached the laundry room, they were met with a sight that would haunt them for years. 3 bodies lay scattered across the wreckage, their blood pooling into one indistinguishable stain. The machines kept spinning, churning clothes, as though nothing had happened, filling the room with the steady hum of routine life in prison. But the massacre had ended any sense of normalcy. There was no clear killer to name, no survivor to explain the sequence of events. Only the undeniable truth remained. The triangle that began as companionship had ended in destruction, leaving the laundry room as the stage for one of the bloodiest incidents in the prison's history. The aftermath of the massacre at Stone Mill Correctional Facility left scars that would never fully fade. When the guards stormed into the laundry room and found the 3 men sprawled across the blood-soaked floor, shock rippled through the entire prison. Violence was nothing new inside those walls, but the scale of destruction, the sheer intimacy of the carnage, made this tragedy different. The guards stood frozen for moments longer than they should have, staring at the scene as if their minds needed time to accept what their eyes were showing them. The sterile space of the laundry, once a backdrop to monotonous labor, had been transformed into something resembling a battlefield. In the days that followed, the prison buzzed with speculation. Inmates whispered about what had happened, each story more dramatic than the last. Some said Damien had orchestrated the whole thing, manipulating both Caleb and Luis until they snapped. Others insisted Luis had planned it, finally striking out after being pushed aside too many times. A few claimed Caleb, quiet and overlooked, had reached his breaking point and turned against the very men he once clung to for safety. No 2 versions of the story were alike, and none could be proven. The only certainty was that all 3 were dead, their secrets buried with them. Investigators tried to piece together the sequence of events, but the evidence was chaotic. The weapon was smeared with blood from all 3 men. The room torn apart in ways that suggested each had fought desperately until the end. The coroner's report gave no easy answers either. Each man carried wounds that could have been fatal. Damien's chest had been punctured deeply. Luis's body bore multiple slashes, and Caleb had injuries that showed he had been caught in the middle of the frenzy. There was no single narrative that fit neatly, No way assign blame without ignoring key details. The official report labeled the tragedy as a triple homicide incident with unclear aggressor. That cold phrase did little to capture the reality of what had happened. The prison administration faced its own storm. Questions poured in from journalists, activists and families of other inmates. How had 3 men been allowed to work together unsupervised? How had a weapon been smuggled into the laundry? How had tensions escalated so violently without intervention? Officials responded with vague statements about ongoing investigations and new safety protocols, but their words rang hollow to those who had seen the aftermath firsthand. Within the prison itself, the massacre became a kind of cautionary tale. Guards spoke about it in hushed tones, and inmates used it as a reminder of how quickly bonds could twist into something fatal. For those who had known Damien, Caleb, and Luis, the story carried a weight that numbers and reports could not capture. Damien had been a man feared and respected, someone who used his strength to build control but also to shield those closest to him. Caleb had been fragile, a man out of place in prison, who found safety in the very bond that would destroy him. Luis had been desperate for belonging, his emotions too strong for the environment that punished weakness at every turn. Each of them had sought something human in an inhuman place, and in the end, it had devoured them. The laundry room itself became a symbol. Though it was scrubbed clean, machines repaired, and work resumed weeks later, there was an unease that clung to the space. Inmates who had to work there often glanced at the walls as though expecting to see bloodstains reappear. Some refused to speak while inside, as if silence could shield them from whatever curse lingered. To them the room was haunted, not by ghosts in the literal sense, but by the weight of what had happened, by the memory of 3 men who had destroyed one another in its confines. As the years passed, the story of the massacre grew beyond the prison. It was retold in local news segments, discussed in criminal justice forums, and eventually whispered about like folklore. Each retelling shifted the details, but the core remained the same. 3 men, bound together in a forbidden relationship, had spiraled into jealousy and violence until all were dead. Some painted it as a tragedy of love gone wrong, others as a cautionary tale about power and obsession, and a few as a reminder that even in places designed to control men, emotions could erupt with devastating force. The truth, however, remained elusive. No one could ever know for certain who struck first, who begged for mercy, or who believed in their final moments that they had won. The walls of Stone Mill kept those secrets locked away, just as they had locked away the men themselves. What was left was a mystery that could never be fully solved, only remembered through fragments and speculation. In the end, the massacre was not just about 3 deaths. It was about what happens when human need collides with confinement, when intimacy is born in a place that allows no room for tenderness, and when power becomes more important than survival itself. The relationship that had once made Damien, Caleb and Luis inseparable ended in a way that made them inseparable forever, bound together in death as they had once been in life. Their story remained a chilling reminder that inside the walls of Stone Mill, even love could turn into the sharpest weapon of all.